Hi, Dr. Mithu. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so tell us about yourself and how your work in neuroscience led you to write your book, Hyper-Efficient, Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work.
So I've been always been very interested in looking at mental performance from a neuroscience dynamics point of view, as in what's actually going on inside the head. But what really brought me to this book was over the last few years, I've been, interacting with a couple of organizations talking about mental performance, stress resilience, and burnout. And while doing that, I realized that we're talking a lot about stress and about burnout and about engagement and employee attrition, especially given 2020. And I thought that, you know what, maybe the answer or the solution isn't just about how to deal with work on the surface. Maybe we need to go a little bit deeper. And then I realized that actually, what we really need to be looking at is, are we working in the right way for the brain?
Wow. And I feel like what kind of research do you like once you decide, okay, that's where I think we should focus on, how do you do this research? Do you try to get companies to volunteer to be the guinea pigs? Like how does that part work?
So, really, in three levels. So, I took lots of feedback from the people I work with. I then looked at the scientific literature on this and actual kind of lab experiments. And you'd be surprised at how many situations can be simulated in a lab. Not always as accurately as you'd imagine, as you'd hope, but there's a lot of opportunity for simulation. So I take those studies. And I also took a kind of a wide-angled view, kind of a historical perspective to understand why it is that we are stuck in this 9 to 5 continuous, constant pace routine.
Yeah. Well, that's what my is perfect segue to my next question, which is I feel like, productivity, maximizing outcomes, working more efficiently. These are just some of the words, us office workers hear all the time. And then it's, of course, now the message is you better be using AI to do it all faster and be more efficient. And I'm curious for you, what's not working with those messages? Because that is absolutely the message I think a lot of us are hearing is almost like find ways to do what you're doing, but faster and better.
So the two things that are wrong with that message are faster and better. And the reason is the following. So if you look at the way we work, we started to get into this pattern of working really during Ford and Taylorism and during the time of the assembly line, when factory work was made most efficient by coming in at a certain time in the morning, working continuously at the same pace throughout the day, and then leaving in the evening with a lunch break. Now, at the time, this was a very efficient way to go about it because we were assembling tangible products that fell off an assembly line. And so any moment that you weren't actively working, you were wasting.
Right.
So continuous working meant something. It had a tangible, measurable outcome. And that sort of template was built around looking at work in terms of quantity of or volume of products assembled. Now, fast forward a little bit until after the Second World War, when we shifted to doing more knowledge work and we shifted into offices. And when we did, we changed the work we were doing, the nature of the work we were doing. So work went from the hands to the head, but we never really changed how we were doing it. And the kind of the 9 to 5, as Dolly Parton famously sang about, the 9 to 5 rhythm or 9 to 6 rhythm really continued. It sort of just stayed on. We didn't really have a need to change it. And if you look at the pyramid of any organization, the hierarchical pyramid, so far within knowledge work, this system has worked because most layers of the pyramid, bar the top, did a form of, clerical work, kind of very mechanical, simple cognitive work. And the decision makers, the creative idea generators, they were right at the top of the pyramid. So their population was very small compared to the entire pyramid of any organization. Now that's all set to change, right? And so now, because of AI and because of, automation and technology in general, the kind of easy cognitive work, and when I say easy, I don't mean these were easy, people work very hard, but the level of sort of, repetitive work. For instance, if you're a junior analyst at the lower part of the hierarchy, for the best part of the last few decades, you would have been responsible for data collection, for writing reports, filing reports, making presentations. Now AI can do a PowerPoint for you. AI collects data better and faster than you can. So all of these jobs, these tasks are now being taken over by machines, which means that if you're a junior analyst now, you're actually doing a little more work that resembles the senior executive. So you are becoming a kind of a preparatory senior executive in many ways. You're having to make decisions as to how you're going to use AI tools. But I think the most important aspect is, if AI and automation are taking over these simple cognitive tasks, and there's data on that, this transition is predicted to be really quite remarkable, then humans are going to be left to using AI as tools to think like a senior executive, even whatever your rank in the hierarchy is. So
Right.
you have to get really good at idea generation, at solving problems, at coming up with unique human solutions which kind of create your unique selling point in the workplace. You have to become irreplaceable. And so the first step towards doing that is to think of work and think of efficiency in terms of quality, in terms of how good your product is, not simply volume, but value. And as soon as you start doing that, the whole idea of working from 9 to 5 in the same way just flies out of the window, because in order to produce really good mental output, you have to let the brain work at its own natural rhythm and pace. And its natural rhythm is rhythmic. So if you squash it and force it to work like a straight line, it can produce output, it can file letters, it can write emails, it can produce presentations, but you're not going to get the peaks that you would get if you were to let the brain work in its own way.
Wow. I like the visual of that. I just like drew it on a piece of paper. Like the visual of that is going like this. I know you guys can't see me. I'm kind of going up and down versus what we force it to do is that straight line. It reminds me of, have you ever seen those charts where it's like a successful career, like what you think it is, and it's like this linear, upwards angled line straight versus like what a successful career really is. And to your point, it's all wiggly, right? And it's interesting how much we fight that, whether it's in the day-to-day work, in when we think of a career path, it's like the natural way to do things is to kind of go with the flow, right? There's a whole thing about flow state, all that good stuff. So that is so interesting. I love the way you described it, when the work went from the hands to the head, and now we should be focused more on quality. All of us are becoming almost like these executive leaders where our skill set is about problem solving, idea generation, relationship building, influence at work, right? These are the skills that AI can't do. In a way, we all just got a promotion. And so we should maybe be really like excited about that, because we get to use our brains in these less tedious ways. I mean, I can remember, people have heard this story, but like in one of my first jobs, I was literally feeding paper through a printer, and I had that thought, like, why am I doing it? It's that kind of mind numbing work that you're doing where you'll be doing less of that. That's so interesting. Anyway, I'm totally on board with what you're saying. So tell us about the brain's natural rhythm. We talked about a little bit why it matters, but how do you, I guess, figure out what your natural rhythm is? Is this something like I've heard of, people who will talk about like cycles thinking for women, where that's like kind of getting in tune of like where your hormones at. But so like, I understand this a little bit, but tell me, what is natural rhythm and how do you figure out yours?
So you're right. We have rhythms at every level of our physiology. right? Some are more obvious than others, but they exist. And you mentioned the menstrual cycle. You can also think about the circadian cycle, which is your day-to-day 24-hour rhythm. And one very interesting piece of data that's emerged is that if you look at your 24-hour rhythm, you will find that the peaks of creative thinking actually happen at a different time in the day from the peaks of focus, right? So, and intuitively, you might find that this rings true with you, because I speak when I tell people about this, they say, oh, it's true, because when I was trying to figure out how to solve this, the idea just came to me when I was just doodling at night. And so the peaks of creativity seem to happen first thing in the morning, in the early hours of the morning, and last thing in the evening, sort of in the early hours of the night, right? So they happen before we go to work, if your work is a traditional kind of 10 to 5, 10 to 6 job, and they happen after you leave work,
Of
right?
course.
So, of course, of course. So that's a first very interesting pattern. Second pattern that links in with this is focused attention work. So the times when you are best, your brain seems to do very well at focusing, are mid to late morning. And there's a very interesting, very conspicuous post-lunch dip when you feel that, your attention isn't quite as sharp as it was before lunch. And that isn't at all related to lunch. It can be made worse by it, but it also happens whether or not you eat. So there's a post-lunch dip, and then your attention again gets better towards the end of the afternoon and early evening. So already here you see these kind of pockets of waxing and waning states of the brain, and these repeat themselves from one day to the next. And then you can kind of zero in on that and say that, and look at actually, how does your attention fluctuate while you're in this focused zone? And then we have data on that suggests that we have this 90-minute fluctuation of attention. So if you are doing a kind of a session of work and you are paying attention, then give yourself a break after 90 minutes. Some people will be familiar with this because there's a tradition called the Pomodoro technique. There's a tomato clock, which some people might be familiar with. But this is, again, a rhythmic cycle. And, on a very general level, you will intuitively, you might remember how you might, the last time you were working on something, right? And it was something quite difficult. You might remember that there was a kind of a burst of attention or just clicking, and you worked really well for maybe 20 minutes, for an hour, and then suddenly that was just gone. The work was the same, you were sitting the same way, but that was just gone. And that's a sign that your brain cannot work like an assembly line. It cannot work at the same pace. So it waxes and wanes. And when it kind of withdraws, one of the reasons is it gets tired. So fatigue is one of the reasons why you kind of drift off. And it needs to have that dip after having that peak. So if you deny it that dip, it cannot reach a peak in the next cycle. So you kind of flat line. So you produce quantity, but your quality could be, and I'm just pulling a figure out of the air here, but your quality could be something like 60% constantly. Whereas if you were to wax and wane with the way you work, you could go to, again, figure pull it out of the air, but you can go up to like 100%, 90%, and then 0, 90%, and then 0. And so one way that I suggest that seems to work quite well is to think about work in terms of working each session, each 90-minute session, as a kind of power law. So what I mean by that is, if you're at work and you say, okay, I'm going to give my brain 10 minutes of really good work, and then I'm going to just have a snooze for an hour, chances are your manager isn't going to be very happy. Your colleagues will be very jealous. That's not going to work, right? So a better way of doing it is by saying, okay, I'm not going to do sprints and rests. I'm going to do a sprint followed by moderate pace, followed by light pace. So I'm going to kind of spend every session of work as this kind of undulating cycle. So if you're doing super, super intense work, you're going to do it for a really short time, short proportion of that cycle. then you're going to just release the pedal and release yourself into lighter work. So you will still be getting work done, but you will give your brain, if you do this conscientiously, you will give your brain ample time to recuperate so that it can maintain its peak when the next cycle comes.
Wow, I think I heard of this, or at least I read an article, I think it was by Adam Grant, and he was talking about attention residue. And almost like what you're talking about, like if you don't give your brain enough space between one thing to the next thing, it's like this perpetual residue is like building up, and you, to your point, your quality is never 100%. What about, I mean, you brought up a good point about like structuring your day. Like what are how can we structure a work session to maximize efficiency, or like what environmental modifications can we do that will help us achieve our goals of like trying to do high quality work? We're not trying to use AI and then, half-ass the work either.
So one metaphor that I find quite helpful is I've tried to, I'm asking the reader. So I suggest people think of the brain as an engine, and the engine, or a car if you prefer, and the engine runs in three speeds or three powers. So we can see it as running in three gears: gear 1, gear 2, and gear 3. When you're sitting down to work, you will perform your best in what is, according to this framework, gear 2. In gear 2, because of the way your hormones distribute themselves, in gear 2, your brain is perfectly poised. You kind of have the kind of an optimal Goldilocks level of norepinephrine, making your brain perfectly poised to be able to focus, to stay engaged, and to kind of think in a very complex way. So critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, all of those things. You're in this zone when you are looking at your work, which might be on a screen, and you need to put in a little bit of effort, but you are able to focus. It's reasonably okay, right? It's good. You don't have to struggle. You're not in this zone if every time you're trying to focus, your attention is just melting away. And you also know you're not in this zone if every time you're trying to focus, you can hear that drilling outside. It's really loud, and your colleagues' chatter on their phone next door is really interfering with your attention. So these are the two extremes when you're not in this Goldilocks zone. So when you sit down to work, first figure out, are you in this Goldilocks zone or not? If you're not, if you're concentrating, but then you just can't keep your focus, it's just drifting away, and you're thinking about your next vacation, you're thinking about how your dog is at home, all of these things. If that's the case, you are lower in this 1, 2, 3 power spectrum. Your mind is kind of slower, a little kind of more wandering. Then you need to create an environment that forces your brain to push down on its pedal. So you need to increase stimulation, and you need to increase the load that you're dealing with. And as an example, multitasking is often seen as bad, right? But it can actually also be really good and really helpful if you are doing something that's very boring or very monotonous, that you really have to do. Doing something in parallel forces your brain to push down on the pedal, and suddenly you click into the right mental state. And now going to the opposite extreme. So if you are sitting there working very well, and just miraculously a cup of coffee appears next to you, you drink it, you're carrying on working well, and someone, you have a really nice, kind colleague who keeps making coffee, the coffee keeps appearing, you keep drinking one cup after the other, and suddenly you were working well, but now every little thing is distracting you, right? That is gear 3. So if you're in that zone, what you have to do is you have to tone down the stimulation around you, lighten the load on your brain, not giving your mind a reason to have to push down on the pedal, and also play with your perception of time. So anything that is slow and low around you, makes your brain think that time is passing slowly. And as soon as your brain thinks time is passing slowly, it comes off the pedal. So these are some tricks that you can use.
So I'm like taking your gears and I'm applying it to myself, and I'm thinking, okay, gear two, I know when that's happening. I'm kind of getting things done. I'm making progress. The ideas are coming to me. I'm not totally struggling, right? And that usually does happen mid-morning, I would say. And then the other time, gear one, I can feel it. It's like I need to go for a walk. I feel this a lot when I'm on meetings with people because I work remotely. So my meetings are always over Zoom. So I have a walking treadmill so I can walk while I'm having the meeting because I need like the extra stimulation. Sometimes I will multitask a little bit during those times because I feel like if I put in a load of laundry and I prep, something that's like I've been thinking about, if I get those things done, that I can come back and it's a little easier to get into a gear two. So these are just like, I'm trying to give you guys some real examples of how I would apply this to my life. Gear three is like, sometimes it's like my kids will come home from school. I'm trying to work. Someone comes in my office, they need something else. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I have to lock my door because I'm like, I need the safety net of like, it's too much. I need to like quiet everything around me. So I'm really resonating with these three gears. I didn't think about them in that way, but I can like illustrate how these are happening in my own life. And I guess, for people who maybe still work a 9 to 5 or, their employer has set hours, is there like an optimal way to organize your workday? Or, I mean, like, should you say something like, okay, I'm going to do focus time from this time to this time, so I don't want to be part of any meetings? Like, I do feel like a lot of times, at least in my world, meetings will be during times when I might be in gear two. So what do I do? How do I how do I nicely tell them like that's my good time to work?
So, in the perfect world, and this is something I'd love to see happen, and every organization I speak to, I encourage them to do this. Of course, it's not always completely possible. Is given the information that we've just discussed, how about we apply it in a kind of a top-down manner? So, what this would look like is whatever you're doing in an organization, whatever your team is doing, look at your project now, look at the kind of project you're working on. Does your project involve focused work, right? If it does, then you as a manager, as a leader, or you as a team, and you can negotiate this with your manager, keep the morning zone protected. So do not schedule meetings during that morning zone. Do not schedule meetings during the late afternoon peak. Put all meetings into the post-lunch dip when you don't
Yeah.
need to pay attention. And really protect those hours for those who are doing this kind of work. Similarly, if you're doing creative work, why not have a negotiation with your manager and have a kind of trade-off? Say, okay, I really peak first thing in the morning, so I'm going to actually come in really, really early. Or if you're working from home, start really, really early. But as a trade-off, I'm going to have a bigger lunchtime, and you can schedule your meetings during the times when you would normally focus, when you're out of your creative zone. So rather than forcing everyone, regardless of what they're doing, to follow the same rigid pattern of work, especially with globalized connected companies, this is a problem, right? When you have to coordinate meetings across the board. But instead of doing that, if you from the management level can get individuals or teams to tailor their schedule on the go, depending on the precise kind of work they're doing, you're much more likely to fall into the right mental state. So, for instance, if you are doing something that involves focusing and you've had meetings all morning, so you couldn't do it during the morning, your morning spot of, zone of peak focus. Instead, you're catching up immediately after lunch because there's a deadline. You really have to sit down and work at it. If you're doing the work after lunch, you are working against your brain's rhythms. So what's happening? Your brain is having to work harder. So you're pushing down harder on the pedal, which means your brain is going to become fatigued more quickly. Now, if you keep working on when your brain is fatigued, you're going to slide into either gear 3 or gear 1, So your work is not going to be of the quality you want. You will produce work, of course, but you're not going to produce the kind of work that maybe a machine might be able to, replicate. So you have to, it's a kind of negotiation. So instead, if you were to work in the morning when your focus is at its peak, you kind of use the wave of your circadian rhythm to get yourself into the right gear. So you're not fighting against the rhythm, you're actually
Right.
surfing on the wave, right?
Yeah.
So you're having to put in less effort, which means you're less likely to get tired, and so your brain isn't going to kind of slide off because of fatigue.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you're making about when you go kind of with your rhythm, it's like things are coming more natural to you. And I think sometimes you'll hear, like, for example, if someone's super efficient, it's like, oh, well, then give them more work. It's clearly too easy for them. And it's like, maybe it's not that it's too easy for them. Maybe they're just working in their most efficient zones. And so they're able to do really high quality work. Like I really want to push back on this notion. You talked about it before, like where we glorify, someone's output versus glorifying the quality of something, right? Like if you put out 100 things, but they're at a C+ level, is that really that much better than, 10 things at 100% level? So I do think also there's a balance at work where it's like, does everything have to be an A+ level? Probably not. But now that we are maybe using more automation and AI tools to maybe some of those smaller tasks that we're totally fine being C+, as they didn't, good enough was totally fine for them. If that is being automated out and it's being taken off our desk, then okay, then the idea generation, the problem solving, those things probably do need to be a higher percentage, right? Good enough isn't going to probably be where you want to land for this like big ad campaign that you need an idea for. I want to talk about that because the one thing I could see happening with this is with AI and like kind of this efficiency model is like decision fatigue. What do we do when the mental muscle gets tired and there's some decision fatigue from feeling like, okay, I used to have a bunch of small tasks, like low hanging fruit that I could kind of get through. And now, whenever I am working, it feels like bigger stuff.
Yeah, so this whole kind of the landscape we're working in is changing so drastically that it is it's a really delicate balance at the moment. And as we progress, I'm sure that the difference in quality versus quantity will become more stark. Decisions are really interesting because if we had this conversation about 5, 10 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation because we would think, oh well, you know um, AI is going to be a great information gathering and prediction machine, but we're ultimately going to be making the decisions. But now, of course, in legal circles and in other circles, the low-level decision making is being done by AI. And so we are having to carry out a kind of a higher level decision making, which factors in many things, which looks at things in a way that AI cannot look at. And one example to illustrate this is there is a very quite a popular anecdote about what happened during the Second World War when US fighter planes were coming back riddled with holes, and they were trying to figure out how to reinforce those planes to make them even more robust. And at first, everyone assumed that, okay, look at the places where the holes are, we'll reinforce those parts. But then one mathematician said, no, 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 you're looking at it all wrong. That's the data we have. What about the data we don't have? The planes that didn't make it back actually didn't make it back because they had holes in the places that are in that seem to be intact here. So we need to remember that there is, to kind of have this kind of lateral, broad way of thinking. And even amongst humans, that's quite a difficult perspective to take because there was just this one mathematician who came up with that to override the group decision. So that's going to have to be the kind of level of decision making that we'll have to end up doing. And there are a couple of quick tips which are helpful. So first of all, every decision, every tough decision, actually, I'm going to repeat that in a different way. Not every tough decision, even a simple decision like choosing ice cream, every decision is effortful, because every time you make a decision, you're a little bit like a judge passing a judgment. So you have to collect the evidence, you have to analyze it, and then you pass judgment, right? So collecting the evidence is actually quite light, relatively speaking. It's like going shopping and saying, that dress looks good, that doesn't look so good, I'll think about it. Okay, so one way to make decisions immediately lighter is to split it into gathering data and actually making the decision. As soon as you do that, it feels lighter. And this is true whether you're getting an ice cream or buying a dress or deciding on a merger. All of these have the same thought process, okay? Second aspect is when you're making a decision, if you're having to choose between 10 things, it's much, much harder than choosing between just 2. So always narrow your options, even if it just means having a filter, right? Having a very rough estimate of just saying, okay, instead of deciding between 10 options, I'm going to just remove the extremes and say that's definitely a no, that's definitely a yes. So that's one way of doing it. And the third thing to remember is that decisions are so tiring that there is a bunch of data that shows that it's not how long you've been working if you're doing a decision-making job. Your fatigue is proportional to the number of decisions you're making. So if you're making 2 decisions in half an hour, you will be as tired after half an hour as someone making 2 decisions in 10 minutes will be after 10 minutes. So pace yourself and have lots of breaks in between. Those are the 3 best ways to keep decision fatigue light.
I love that. That's super helpful, very actionable. Dr. Mithu, this has been so incredibly enlightening, and I think it's so helpful to just like remind ourselves to pay attention, have that self-awareness of these rhythms. Tell people where they can find your book, learn more about you, follow your work.
Thank you so much for having me. My book is called Hperefficient. If you want a direct link to it, you can go to my website, mithustoroni.com, but most bookstores will have it. It goes on sale on the 17th of September. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn or through my website.
Amazing. Well, our audience loves LinkedIn, so get ready. Everybody, we will put all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me.